Welcome, everyone, to the Over Under Movie Podcast, where we take a prominent figure or franchise in the world of filmmaking and ask the simple question, are they overrated or underrated? And on today's pod, we're talking about the Snyderverse.
This is our first episode ever. We should talk about that, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. This is our first one that we're recording. I don't know if this is going to be the first one that we release. I guess we'll see what it's like on the editing side of things. But yeah, the DCEU, not exactly small potatoes for our first episode.
Yeah, it's ending. We're coming in right at the end of it and looking at, I guess, the start of it.
It's a real transition point for the DC side of comic book movies. I would say that the DCEU is generally regarded as an abject failure. And it's so much of a failure that they're doing a complete and total reboot, basically, of it. Recasting actors, starting all the Superman, the Batman, everything is starting over. So we thought with this transition point coming up with this movie franchise, be a perfect opportunity for our first episode here.
And it's really interesting to go back and look at how it all started and where it all went wrong, try and figure it all out. But basically, I have to argue that this project is underrated. And I think I've got some ideas in mind. You know, I watched every single one of these movies, and I had a time.
Yeah, so just to give everybody a brief synopsis of how this podcast is going to go, we're going to start off just by talking about the DCEU. We'll go through the timeline of events, talk about, what we thought about the movies. Are they good or are they bad? The overrated versus underrated side of things is really interesting because I think we can both agree that generally speaking, the DCEU sucks. They're not good movies. There's a few good ones in there, and we'll talk about those. But for the most part, they're not good movies. And I think for a podcast conversation, it's not interesting for us to just talk about how bad these movies are. What's more interesting is to try to get a baseline of how are they rated? What is the conventional agreement on these films? And is that overshooting things or is that undershooting things? And so we're going to have, in the first part of this podcast, do a little back and forth between the two of us. And then in the back half of the podcast, I'll be making my pitch for why it's overrated. And then Jason will be making his pitch for why it's underrated. And we'll be switching the over-under arguments based on the episodes here. So it should be a good time.
First, we have to determine how this thing is rated in the eyes of the general public. Are we talking about movies from Man of Steel all the way up to Blue Beetle? By the way, Blue Beetle just came out as of us recording this.
Yeah, I heard it's pretty good. I'm probably not going to see it in theaters. Are you going to see it in theaters?
It's been out for about a week. I think it's going to be out of theaters by the time we finish recording this podcast, so I'm not sure if I'm going to make it. I would have liked to have seen it, but, we spent a long time setting up this studio. If you're only listening to the audio, you should know that the studio looks pretty nice.
Yeah, so this is both an audio and video podcast. We will be cross-posting these episodes to wherever you get your podcasts, so Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever. But we're also going to be putting full episodes up on YouTube. But yeah, it's interesting when I was doing research for this episode. So the DC Extended Universe, you're right, is generally considered to be everything from Man of Steel, which came out in 2013, all the way up until, I believe, Aquaman 2, which will be coming out this upcoming December.
Oh, that's
going to be the hard endpoint for the DCEU.
I forgot about that already.
However, the DCEU is not what we're going to be titling this podcast. What we're going to be calling it is the Snyderverse. So what is the Snyderverse? And I think we have differing opinions on what the Snyderverse actually is.
Right. So, in my opinion, I would consider the Snyderverse to be the films that Zack Snyder actually directed for this cinematic universe. So that includes Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, and Zack Snyder's Justice League, which of course is a re-released director's cut of the 2017 Justice League movie.
So in your opinion, this podcast is basically going over a movie trilogy?
Essentially, but then we can kind of dig into the changes between the original Justice League movie and the Snyder cut. We can talk a little bit about the executive decisions that he made as kind of the keeper of the kings to the kingdom. So, for example, he was the one who cast Gal Gadot.
Gal Gadot.
How do you say
it? It's Gadot, yeah.
Gal Gadot. He's the one who cast Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. But Patty Jenkins obviously directed the Wonder Woman film. So, some of his decisions still influenced other films within this franchise.
In the way that I kind of look at it, and it's different opinion than what we were talking about before, I actually don't think you would call the Snyderverse everything up until Aquaman 2 at this point. I would say the Snyderverse ended when his Justice League cut came out, which was in 2021. It was released, I believe, directly to HBO Max because we were still in the height of the pandemic. I would say that his executive role in the DCEU makes that whole chunk of films from Man of Steel to his Justice League cut. That should be the Snyderverse. And let me just go over the films for you real quick. Man of Steel came out in 2013. Obviously, Zack Snyder. He directed it. Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, that came out in 2016. He was the director, obviously, as part of that. Then we have Suicide Squad in 2016. He's not involved in that. That's basically David Ayer did everything on that. And then, did David Ayer get replaced in that? No, he got replaced on Rogue One. My bad. I'm thinking of the wrong David Ayer movie. Wonder Woman 2017. Patty Jenkins directed it. However, Zack Snyder has a story and producer credit on that movie. So I would say that Zack Snyder definitely involved in that one. Aquaman in 2018 and Shazam in 2019. He didn't do anything for either of those. Birds of Prey. He had nothing to do with the Birds of Prey movie in 2020. Wonder Woman 1984, which was also, I believe, a direct to HBO Max release.
Yep.
He got a producer credit on that, so that's another Zack Snyder movie.
Yep.
And then Justice League, which came out in 2017 originally, reshot by Joss Whedon. We can go deeper into that if we want to. And then he made his own cut of the movie in 2021. Out of those 9 movies, he either has a director, producer, or story credit on 5 of them.
Right.
So I would say that his fingerprints are all over that first. Let's call it, using MCU terms, this is phase 1. If Justice League was meant to be their Avengers movie and Man of Steel is basically their Iron Man, then this is phase 1 of the DCEU, and I would call it the Snyderverse.
I could see the argument for that. I just think, like you said, there's 4 movies where his name's not on it at all. The one that really stands out to me is not feeling like part of the Snyderverse is Shazam. So for most of the other ones you mentioned, at least an actor that he cast in his Justice League movie came back and played that part again in one of these new films. Like Ben Affleck shows up in Suicide Squad. So I could see where you'd say that Snyder's fingerprints are on it. But like Shazam, nothing that Snyder did impacts that movie at all. They couldn't even get Henry Cavill back to be Superman.
Yeah, he was decapitated in the the end shot there.
Yeah. You know who did get Henry Cavill back? Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
So let's quickly talk about the films that have come out after the Snyder cut of Justice League. The Suicide Squad, directed by James Gunn, that came out in 2021. Then The Rock's Black Adam film in 2022. Shazam 2, which came out at the very end of 2022. We have The Flash, which didn't do too great, came out this summer. We have Blue Beetle, which is currently in theaters. I hear it's like solid. So if you want to see like a good superhero movie, all things considered, it sounds like Blue Beetle's good. It's not going to make a lot of money. It's making nothing at the box office right now.
All right, we'll go see it after this.
And then Aquaman 2 at the end of December. Those films, Zack Snyder has been completely hands off, and it's weird because this transition period of the DCEU has kind of left these movies to die.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, they had a big budget marketing push for the Flash movie, and it just didn't work. So now they're doubling down on not promoting their films.
Yeah, it's such a weird strategy that, listen, I understand that if you want to do a complete and total reboot, things are going to get a little messy. This is more than a little messy. That's 6 films that I just named that are kind of just left hanging there. I think part of what makes the MCU interesting, even the movies that aren't good, at least it feels like it's tied into that greater universe. Even something like Eternals, where Eternals is completely separate from the rest of the MCU, at least you know that it's in the same universe and that what is happening in that movie is going to have greater effects on the wider universe. I mean, it might not. I mean, we've seen the meme of the the Celestial coming out of Earth, and it's like it's been X number of movies since this happened in Eternals, and nobody's talked about it. But at least it feels like everything is connected. In the DC movies, like you said, Shazam, it doesn't feel like it exists in the same universe as Batman v Superman.
So I guess we'll see. With these new movies that have come out since Zack really left this universe, I think The Flash is arguably supposed to be the end point of this quote unquote Snyderverse. That's the one where they bring back his main trio from, well, they bring back Wonder Woman and Batman, and they kind of give them these little send offs, and then they do a little soft reboot at the end of that film. Now, you haven't seen The Flash, right?
I have not seen The Flash. My understanding was that it was just going to be like a Flashpoint movie, basically. And Flashpoint, obviously, is kind of like a good way to try to reset your canon.
Right, that's literally what happened in the comics. Flashpoint, I believe, led directly to the New 52, which basically rebooted all of DC for a few years.
How did that movie end? Doesn't it have the George Clooney Batman in it?
Yeah. So basically, the Flash goes back in time, messes up the timeline, and Ben Affleck Batman gets replaced by Michael Keaton Batman. And then he goes back in time again at the end, changes one little thing, and then he's very surprised to see George Clooney show up as Bruce Wayne, and he doesn't know who he is. And it's honestly a funny gag. Originally, that film was supposed to end with like Wonder Woman and Bruce Wayne, played by Ben Affleck, and Michael Keaton show up at the end of that movie and kind of show that, oh, now the old universes are folded into the new universes. It was going to be the whole thing. They decided to end on a little gag instead, which was fine.
Yeah, I mean, from what it sounds like, they really don't fully have the plan, at least like on the public side of things. We haven't really fully seen whatever James Gunn's creative plan is going to be for this franchise. And that's more and more why I think of this first iteration of the DC universe as the Snyderverse, because listen, he was the one that made that first film. On the MCU side of things, Jon Favreau, very involved with the Marvel side of things, and him directing Iron Man 1 really set the tone, literally, for that entire universe.
Sure, but I don't think people really view Favreau as like the keeper of the keys to the MCU. They all cite Kevin Feige, obviously. So I would say Favreau and Snyder honestly had probably the same amount of influence on their respective cinematic universes, but we don't call it the Favreauverse.
That's true. I would say that Favreau probably is more thought of as like the Mandalorian guy now.
Maybe.
If you're using like a Disney project that he's been involved in.
To me, he'll always be the elf guy. Or
Yeah.
Swingers. Have you guys seen Swingers? Oh,
I have to see Swingers still.
that movie's so good.
We'll do that on a pod. We'll do it on a future pod.
We'll do a Favreau episode.
Leave a comment down below. What is a Jon Favreau movie you want us to do a podcast on?
Did he do Zathura?
Why is it Chef?
Oh, yeah, Chef. That guy's had a cool career, but that's not who we're talking about today. All right, you know what? I'm going to concede this argument. I'm going to say you're right. Let's talk about the first, 9 films?
It's the first 9 films.
DCEU. Great, because I have to say that these movies are underrated, and that gives me a lot more to work with.
Well, let's transition that into our rating conversation. How do you think these movies are rated by the general public, by critics?
So at this point in time, I think the main 3 Snyder films are kind of kicked around as like a joke by film critics. Man of Steel, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice especially, and then Zack Snyder's Justice League are all kind of the butt of the joke in a lot of studio and film literature circles. I think Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is especially overrated. It's a bit of a bloated film, but it tries to do a lot, and it does it, so I'll go to bat for it. But I would say overall, most of these movies are forgotten. No one really talks about Suicide Squad except to make fun of it. Aquaman made like $1 billion, and no one can tell me what happens in that movie.
I believe Aquaman is still the highest grossing of these movies by like a pretty comfortable margin.
It's insane to me. It's actually crazy to me. Aquaman was a joke character for years. Like, no one took him seriously. The blonde dude in tights that could talk to fish. And Zack Snyder came in and he was like, what if he was not blonde, but really, really jacked and hot? And that was honestly a smart move.
What if he was jacked and like a total bro?
Yeah, what if he was just a frat boy? The vision for casting Momoa as Aquaman is one of the better parts of the Snyderverse, I would say.
Well, that's probably the most underrated part of this DCEU in general, is that I think the casting is generally pretty good.
Yeah, I like the casting. I think Gal Gadot was really good casting. I think Jason Momoa. Both of these were like unconventional choices because Gal Gadot was
She was a model, yeah.
like a rail thin model. She'd been in, I think, one action franchise, maybe two movies in the Fast franchise, but I don't know if she had done any action films prior to that. And a lot of people criticize her acting, but I think for playing like a goddess, which Wonder Woman kind of is, I think there's something really inspired about the choice.
And Henry Cavill, we got to talk about it. I mean, who was this guy 10 years ago before Man of Steel came out? You know, he's got that chiseled jawline. He looks the part.
Yeah, he was a really good Superman.
It is absurd that James Gunn is just looking at Henry Cavill and is like, listen, we're going to go with a new guy instead.
I mean, I see where James Gunn's coming from, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But it's crazy. I mean, it makes me think of The Witcher with like these franchises that are just looking at Henry Cavill, and he's so charismatic, and he seems like a legit good guy, and he's like kind of nerdy too. So he gets the nerds on his side.
Yeah, I mean, the nerds love him. He has his own like sort of cult fan base that has really gone to bat for him over this losing the Superman role thing, but. You know, we don't really know what goes on behind closed doors, and even though he lost the part, he's still going to be fine. He's still going to play tons of good-looking guys in the future, and I would honestly guess that DC will come into this multiverse game like 10 years later than Marvel, which is just their normal cadence of doing things, and we'll probably see Henry Cavill back in the Superman suit at some point.
Yeah, I'm sure he doesn't mind as much as the fans do. If you look at the MCU actors, like Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, like they seem pretty cool with not doing their superhero characters anymore.
Yeah.
So I could imagine like the DC guys are the same. Getting like through all the okay, so we made the agreement that it's these first 9 films, right?
First 9.
How are they rated? I would say generally people think these movies are bad.
Yeah, I think so too.
They're not just bad, they're like really bad.
I think that's the general feeling for pretty much all of them, even the ones that made $1 billion, Aquaman. Like, I think most audiences in their minds now do not like these films.
But what makes this complicated is that specifically Batman v Superman, it was one of the first movies I can remember that had such a giant chasm between critic reviews and audience reviews. Where if you go on Rotten Tomatoes right now, I think it's like 29% or something like that for the critic score, which for anybody that doesn't know how Rotten Tomatoes works, that's just crazy. Like, it is really, really hard for a film to get that low of a score with, I mean, it's Batman v Superman. I'll just say, like, cards on the table. I was super, super excited for Batman v Superman. On paper, it seems too big to fail. Mm-hmm. It's such a cool concept. Just have a movie about Batman and Superman fighting each other. And then we get to the movie, and they're fighting each other because Lex Luthor manipulated them into fighting each other. And then they fight Doomsday.
Right. Yeah, that's where the film really loses me, and I think most audiences. I still think 29 is like way too low for... It's too low for almost any movie. And even though that movie has too much going on, it still had sort of a singular vision. It still had a singular style. Whether or not you like Zack Snyder's style, he at least has this throughput to his films and ideas that I think is admirable. Whatever, we're not on this segment yet where I really go to bat for it, but I just got to put my opinion out there.
But would you agree that what critics think of these films versus what like DC fans think of these films, it's completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know what the audience score was on Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, but I know that the box office was quite high. This film really was too big to fail. It made money.
And then we look at Justice League, and how does the Justice League movie end up the way it did? I mean, we could talk a little bit about the behind the scenes of that movie. A lot of problems with the production side of things. It's still not clear to me like whether Zack Snyder was actually fired from Justice League or if he actually stepped away. I mean, his daughter committed suicide. That was what was relayed as the reason for him stepping away from directing Justice League. Eventually, Joss Whedon stepped in. Probably a lot of reshooting from what we saw in the differences between the Zack Snyder cut and the Joss Whedon cut of the movie that came out in theaters. It's just messy. It's super, super messy movie. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think that the Snyder cut of Justice League and the Joss Whedon cut of Justice League are all that different quality-wise. Fundamentally, I think they're the same exact movie. It's just the Snyder one is just a lot longer. He just added a bunch more stuff into it.
So you don't think those 2 hours made a difference in the quality?
Well, I'm of the opinion that the shorter a movie is, the better.
Oh, yeah?
So on that metric alone, the Joss Whedon one is infinitely better.
Are you going to share that opinion on every episode of this podcast?
Yeah, probably. We gotta hit that point home.
I've been watching movies with Dylan to prep for this podcast, and he says this after every single movie. He's like, yeah, I think it could have been about 15, 30 minutes shorter.
Listen, Jason, we are not young men anymore.
Yeah.
Our time on this planet is limited. And I don't have time to be sitting through 2 hours and 40 minutes of every single movie I watch.
Or 4 hours of Zack Snyder's Justice League.
I swear to God, when I saw the Snyder Justice League on HBO Max, I like paused the movie with it where I thought was like we were like getting into the third act, and I was an hour and 20 minutes in, and I saw how much film was left, and I was like, there is no fucking way.
Yeah.
There's this much movie left.
I remember when that movie came out, one of my buddies came over. All my roommates sat down to watch it. We made a day out of it, but we had to split it up into 2 parts. So we knew beforehand. We were like, we start the movie at 10 a.m., go do lunch at noon, maybe go to the bookstore, maybe just kind of walk around the park, come back at like 3 o'clock, finish the movie. And we did, and that's the best way to watch it.
The Snyder Cut is the poster child for why you don't give directors the cut of movies, because they're not going to cut anything. Every director thinks that everything he shot is perfect.
And he put it back in. He put more in. Like obviously he had to do some reshoots, but there was some stuff where obviously it was never going to be in his original cut, and he just did it because he could.
He's like, listen, that old god sequence, we need to make 30 minutes out of that guy.
Whatever. Good for him, I say. I mean, he knew this was his last hurrah playing in that sandbox, and he went big.
But I would say if we're going to come to an agreement on what the rating is for the Snyderverse, I would say it's pretty low.
It's pretty low. Do you know there's a Snyder Cut joke in the Barbie movie that just came out?
Amazing.
It's really funny. So I guess I'll spoil it.
Spoilers for the Barbie movie.
Skip for the next 10 seconds if you haven't seen Barbie yet, but everyone has. It's made $1 billion.
Except for me. I'm the only one that hasn't seen it on the whole world.
He doesn't support women. So in the Barbie movie, there are characters, I'm going to try to not spoil this as best I can, but there are characters that learn about what patriarchy is and try to bring it back to Barbie land. And they start mind-washing the Barbies into being subservient and docile women, and it's terrible, it's bad. One of the Barbies gets unbrainwashed, and she wakes up, and she's like, oh my God, I don't remember anything that happened. I just feel like I was in a haze where I really, really cared about the Zack Snyder Justice League cut.
Wait, they say that verbatim?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is the Barbie movie like Warner Brothers, or is it like another studio? Okay, so they're making fun of themselves.
Well, I mean, they broke up with Zack Snyder, or he broke up with them, so they're making fun of their ex, kind of.
That's rough. I thought the joke was going to be that their mothers were both named Martha or something.
That's too easy. No, this one, I would argue that the Barbie movie was not making fun of Zack Snyder or his cut of Justice League. It was making fun of the Release the Snyder Cut movement, which is the fan base online that really rallies around this film franchise.
Yeah, shout out to the DC fanboys that are just like, you know, these like bad movies, we're going to go to bat for them regardless.
It's so funny.
We are going down with the ship.
No, I'm glad I wish they would stop now because it's kind of over, but I'm glad they did the push to get the Snyder Cut out of Justice League, because I thought that was a cool thing. You don't see that. You don't see directors get to have their vision fully put out into the world very often. So even if it's for a film and film franchise where we don't like it that much, I still think it's such an interesting thing to get to see. But yeah, lowly rated, and lowly rated enough that it will be made fun of in the Barbie movie.
Is the Save Martha moment in Batman v Superman just like the most unintentionally hilarious moment of any like otherwise serious superhero film?
It gets a lot of laughs. I actually think the moment works. I wasn't like, oh my God, they're both named Martha, this is so emotional. But I was like, yeah, this story-wise, this makes sense. It's two characters finding a shared humanity, and they find it through the fact that they both have moms.
They both have moms that are named Martha.
Okay, I'm laughing now, but I think it works on paper.
It's a moment that, like, if you take like 2 steps back from, it makes no sense at all, and if you take like 10 steps back, it's the funniest thing ever. Because if one of their mothers had a different first name, the entire universe is done. It's over. It's Jover.
Yeah, but that's like how comic books are. They're stupid, and it's like, it's fun, and it's about finding shared humanity. I don't know. I go to bat for that moment.
That's the ultimate retort to like anybody criticizing the DC movies is like, listen, comics suck sometimes too.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that.
Nothing is more comic booky than making bad stories.
Bad, big, bloated stories, which is kind of exactly what Batman v Superman and the Justice League were. But like, it was cool. It was cool to see.
At least like back in like the 80s and 90s, the comic book companies would be like mask off with it. They're like, listen, we don't give a shit about the story. We're here to sell toys.
Yeah. Yeah, dude. They made so many Batmobiles for those Batman.
We need more costume changes in the movie so we can make more toys.
Yeah, and I think Zack Snyder stuck to that mandate too. I think he had a lot of cool costumes. I think the costuming for the Snyderverse movies was really good as well. We'll talk about that.
So the rating we're gonna go with here is low. We are not. Neither of us are DC fanboys here. We're not gonna say, actually, these are pretty good.
I'm wearing a DC shirt for those of you who aren't watching. But I got this like way before Zack Snyder got the job. I've had this since like 2007. Anyway.
I will say that I'm cautiously optimistic about the new DC movies. I'm sure if we're still doing the podcast like 5-6 years from now, when we can like see the entire phase 1 of whatever James Gunn's universe is going to be, I think there's a good chance that it's good. I mean, these are good heroes with really long histories behind them. They have a lot of stories that they can pull from. I think that this franchise just suffered from, they tried speedrunning things too much.
Yeah, I don't know if that was the real problem. I think the problem is just that they weren't very good movies.
Well, no, the first movie is Man of Steel, and then they immediately go into Batman v Superman. How do you not do a solo Batman movie? Like, how do you not have, especially since they're recasting, right? It makes sense to do exactly what Marvel did. They did an Iron Man movie. They did a Captain America movie. They did a Thor movie. They didn't do a Hawkeye movie because, like, he's one of the minor Avengers. Right. But, like, for Batman and Superman, they should both probably get their own movies first.
No, I see what you're saying, and that's a very common criticism of how it went down, but I don't think that's necessarily true. You can go into these team movies right away. Like, the Guardians of the Galaxy didn't have a Star-Lord movie and a Groot movie. They just jumped right into the full team. And so I think it was fine. I think the movies just weren't very good.
Well, the ultimate counter to my argument here is, have you seen Justice League War, the animated movie?
Yeah.
Justice League War is a really good movie.
It's pretty solid.
And it's just a Justice League movie that also serves as, I believe, an introduction to all of those versions of those characters in animated form. Mm-hmm. And it works just fine. Like, we get Superman intro, we get Flash intro, we get Batman, we get everybody. Green Lantern. It pulls them all together, and then they fight Darkseid at the end of it. And then at the very end of the movie, they're standing up on like the steps of like a courthouse together, and this is the Justice League. They could have taken that script like verbatim and turned it into live action, and it would have made $1 billion easy.
Yeah, that would have been pretty sweet. That whole, I don't know how familiar you are with the DC animated universe. Not that DC animated universe, but there's a whole bunch of movies that take place in the Justice League War universe.
Yeah, I've seen a good number of them. Most of them are solid. Is Flashpoint Paradox in that same universe?
Kind of. It's what leads to it.
And then I've seen Justice League Dark, which is fun. I mean, they could have just pulled those stories directly for live action. It's what makes it interesting, because there's so many why is the animation side of it seemingly so much easier to do than do it in live action?
That's true. Like, you look at the Bruce Timm DC animated universe, and it's like some of the greatest storytelling I've ever seen on television. But they just can't do it with these movies. They're not able to somehow. All right, I'm gonna start talking about why I think this is underrated. So we rank this as lowly rated. Should we have like a scale? Maybe we'll like introduce our own scale. Maybe we'll get a little graphic or something we can hold up that's like a thermometer.
It's rated like 1 to 10.
Yeah, we have it. We have this rated at like a 3, I guess. What do you think?
Sure, we'll call it a 3. I'll write that down.
I think most of our episodes that we've come up with are things that are going to be like 7 and above. This is one of our like least liked things, I think. But I think these things shouldn't be that hated. I think Man of Steel is like a fine origin story movie, and I think it does things differently than like a Marvel film would do it. So there's elements of it that I like. I think Amy Adams is really great as Lois Lane. Henry Cavill was such a good Superman. Then you go into Batman v Superman, which we've been talking about at length here. And I just think there's a lot of cool stuff in that too, actually. I think I really liked the Eisenberg Luthor. I know he's one of the probably the most least liked things in this DC universe.
Yeah, out of all the casting choices that we were praising earlier, I'm not feeling that
I
one.
thought it was so interesting. I think,
I don't need bald Mark Zuckerberg as our Lex Luthor.
and he wasn't even bald in that movie.
He's bald. Yeah, he's bald at the very end.
Yeah, it's so silly. But I think it is inspired to have like this millennial version of Lex Luthor show up for, what's a very modern adaptation.
You know, James Gunn's Lex Luthor is going to be a crypto bro.
I bet he will be. Yeah, he's just gonna be like an Elon stand-in probably.
Oh shit! Yeah, you're right.
But yeah, the Martha thing. I've already said that I liked that moment, even if it is.
You're going to bat for Martha. That's your argument.
I'm gonna do it, even if it's unintentionally funny. I think I see what they were going for. I think there's like almost like a mythological subtext to it about this like god. Even gods have moms. How beautiful is that?
That's something we can all get behind.
Yeah, I think the part where Lex Luthor peed in a jar and
Oh my god, I forgot about that.
and called it Grandma's peach tea and then blew up the courthouse was crazy.
It's inspired.
And I would never see that in like any other superhero movie. It's so weird and so insane. And I was like, damn, I can't believe that just happened. Why did he pee in the jar? So yeah, there's like moments in that are really cool. And I think even though Wonder Woman shows up for no reason and feels out of place, that intro song that she has, her like big hero moment, it all kind of worked. And it set her up really nicely for her own movie, which was great. That's the main thing that I'm gonna say about why this franchise is underrated. A lot of these movies are just good. Wonder Woman is a great film, and I think that one probably is like higher rated in terms of audience minds and cultural relevance. When Nicole Kidman introduces every AMC films, and she's like, "Our heroes feel like part of ourselves," or maybe it's the part where she's like, "Stories are special."
She's specifically talking about the Snyderverse when she does that.
Specifically, she's watching Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman gets on screen to show us that our heroes are bigger than us or part of us, or whatever Nicole Kidman says. And she's right. Like, Wonder Woman is an awesome movie. If we really dug into it, I could have some criticisms of like the third act, but for the most part, I love that movie. Shazam is a really good superhero movie. Birds of Prey is a really cool, really different superhero movie. And these are all ones that we included in year 9, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the casting that Zack Snyder did for all these different characters that kind of show up throughout these movies is really good. Just the tone of the universe. He did it so that, his films can be kind of brutal and dark, but the world can still be whatever these directors need it to be. And I think Patty Jenkins has really gone to bat for Zack Snyder and said that he set her up for success with Wonder Woman. And I just think there's a lot of good stuff in these first 9 films for us to look at.
I will say that there are films in this franchise that are good, or like they're not terrible. And my argument for them being overrated is that it really is all terrible. and And I think my overrated argument is that on the macro scale, this is a failure of a magnitude that we may never see again in movies. They're taking one of the most widely like known IPs on the entire planet. Superman and Batman specifically have histories going back so many decades, and there's blueprints out there for previous good iterations of these characters for them to build off of, and they just completely fell on their face. It's not just that these films are bad. They could have survived a bad movie. Lord knows the MCU has bad movies. They have movies that are considered like really good but are like just okay, you know, like Avengers Endgame. That's a hot take, but you know, Endgame is a movie that's all about the build-up and not really about the plot, right? What makes the DCEU Snyderverse overrated is that it's so bad that it's kind of impressive. It's crazy. I actually think that Man of Steel isn't a bad movie, like in a vacuum. That's the whole thing about these movies is that in a vacuum, Shazam is a fun little movie set in Philadelphia.
Yeah, but shot in Canada.
Yeah, hate to see it.
Boo.
They wanted those Rocky steps in there, I guess. And the fake SEPTA logos.
We live in Philadelphia. That's why we're talking like this.
Wonder Woman, solid movie, like well structured. Wonder Woman 1984 sucks though.
But we're not talking about
which is a tough look. I think if you break these movies up individually, you can kind of say like, oh, this movie's not too bad. Oh, this movie's not too bad. This is okay. But big picture, it's so bad. It's kind of difficult to wrap your mind around how a Batman v Superman movie can be as bad as it is, how a Justice League movie can be as bad as it is. Like it's so and it's tough because we're rating it so low. We rated it a 3 on this scale on this scale that we just made up in this podcast. I'm arguing I have to argue if it's a 1 or a 2. If anybody's got an idea for like a rating system that's like creative and like based on movies, feel free to hit us up. What's our email? overunderpodcastshow@gmail.com. We'll put it in the show notes of this podcast. Feel free to send us emails.
I mean, your basic point was that it's bad, but have you considered that it's actually so bad?
I mean, it really is.
It's not that bad.
It's crazy. It is crazy to look at those first 3 films of Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Justice League, which are all directed by Zack Snyder, and all of them were critically panned. Even though I still don't really understand like what people hate about Man of Steel so much.
It's a little slow and it's a little bleak for a Superman movie, and it's a little bit too under a blue filter for a movie, but it's still a decent movie.
I mean, let me go to bat for Zack Snyder for a second here. First of all, it's not his fault for making these movies. If anything, it's Warner Brothers' fault for hiring the guy that directed 300 and directed Watchmen and said, hey, we're going to give you the keys to our DC universe.
So weird choice for sure.
You know, like, how does Warner Brothers not know what they signed up for? They're like, oh no, this guy makes like dark and like stylized movies. It's like, yeah, have you seen a Zack Snyder movie?
Yeah, I guess that's what they wanted. I mean, coming off of the Dark Knight trilogy, they were like, well, this was dark and gritty and realistic. We should hire a guy that's even darker and grittier. And it just, I mean, it was fine. Like, Zack Snyder's got good movies. 300's a good movie. I would argue that his cut of the Justice League was pretty cool and inspired.
Yeah, his first movie, the Dawn of the Dead remake, solid Dawn of the Dead remake.
The Guardians, Legends of Gahul.
Is that the L movie? I have not seen his L movie.
I haven't either. We're going to do another episode just about Zack Snyder and probably not talk as much about the Snyderverse because I really want to watch that Owls movie, but I kind of need a reason to. I read all the books in that series. Anyway, so
verdict.
Listening to my argument, the first thing I wrote right under underrated argument, it says it can't be that bad. And your entire argument is just that it is that bad.
It is very, very bad.
That's insane. We have truly diametrically opposed arguments. Neither of them are particularly like well-structured arguments. But that aside, has your mind come around? If we think the cultural rating of this movie is a 3, do you think it deserves to be above a 3 or below a 3?
I think, despite my argument here, I think generally speaking, 20 years from now, people will probably look back on these films and say they're not as bad as everybody was saying about them. The main reason they're rebooting these movies is because they're not making money at the box office the way that the Marvel movies are. The Marvel movies can roll out of bed and make $1 billion with like a Doctor Strange movie. Like they can just pick a Marvel character and make a ton of money with any of their characters. And the fact that a Batman v Superman movie can't crack like 700 million, and what Justice League made like 600 million, I think, it's crazy. And the bottom line is the bottom line when it comes to movie making. If the films aren't making money, they're not going to make more movies. And that's the whole reason why this franchise is going to get rebooted here. I think, yeah, the movies aren't very good, but there's other franchises where the movies aren't very good and they keep making more of them. Yeah, I mean, shout out to the Fast and the Furious movies that are just garbage. It's just like CGI and like cars slamming into each other and Vin Diesel talking about family.
We have to watch those movies, and one of us has to argue that they're underrated.
If somebody signs up for our highest Patreon tier, which I think is $50 a month, we will binge watch every single Fast and the Furious movie and do a podcast on it immediately afterwards.
You can be on the podcast too if you give us $50.
Yeah, I think we have that. Go shout out to our Patreon. That is patreon.com/overunderpod. We have tiers starting at $2 as our lowest one. We're kind of getting a free tier. That's a new feature on Patreon that I was not able to get for the podcast just yet, but we're working on that. Make sure to check us out there. I would say though that generally I think underrated is where the dust is going to settle for the Snyderverse.
Yeah, so on the rating scale, a 3 comes in below what our rating for the Snyderverse would be. What would your rating for the Snyderverse be out of 10?
I think ultimately it's going to sit around like a 5.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. Some of the individual movies I'd give like Wonder Woman, I'd give like an 8 or 9, honestly. But yeah, overall it's going to sit at a 5 for me.
Yeah, in a vacuum, I think they're okay, some of the films. Even something like Batman v Superman, if you just want to watch like the third act on its own, it's like a fun little like, action sequence to just watch. The actual like Batman v Superman aspects of that movie are good. It's fun watching them fight each other.
Yep.
Unfortunately, the whole thing just doesn't work.
Yeah, that's it then.
Yep.
That's going to be it for this one, guys. Let us know in the comments. Did we get it right? What are some topics you'd like to see for future episodes? Make sure to leave a like on this episode and consider supporting the show by checking out the Patreon that Dylan just talked about, or checking out our YouTube, rating it on wherever you get your podcasts, all of that. This was our first recording. So
first recording, everybody.
In the bucket. Let's release this a year from now. For myself, for Dylan, we'll catch you guys next week on the Over Under podcast. See you at the movies.